Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, comrades. I've been given the slightly invidious task of speaking after quite a lengthy list of brilliant speakers. And so, with that proviso, I will say something. So, on May the 8th, 1945, people in Britain celebrated VE Day. 6 years of all-out war in Europe against Nazi and fascist tyranny had come to a victorious conclusion. But whilst the nation struggled with a collective hangover the next day, it did so with the knowledge that the war in East and Southeast Asia and in the Pacific continued, and nobody at that stage could be sure for how long. While, as events transpired, the war in Asia-Pacific was to last just a few more months, due not least to the decisive intervention of the Soviet Red Army, rather than to the criminal bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this does serve to underline the fact, as we've heard already from other speakers, of course, that the World Anti-Fascist War began first in the East, specifically in China, and that it lasted the longest. The Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression began, as we've heard, in 1931, after Japan rigged up the puppet state of Manchukuo in northeast China. This in turn became a nationwide war of resistance in 1937, with the Marco Polo or Lugu Bridge incident heralding Japan's all-out invasion. At that time, while progressive people around the world rallied to the support of China, the only state to take a clear-cut stand in support of the Chinese people's resistance was the USSR. And this fact clearly impacted on the entire geopolitical pattern in the region. The Soviet contribution to the defeat of Japanese militarism did not begin with the declaration of war on August the 8th, 1945, the date agreed between the USSR, the United States and Britain at Yalta. A key front was opened more than 10 years previously in the Mongolian People's Republic, with hundreds of clashes on the border with the so-called Manchukuo starting from January 1935. As tensions mounted, it clearly became a matter of when, not if, a major confrontation would take place between Soviet and Japanese forces in or adjacent to Mongolia. The stakes would be high. A decisive Soviet defeat would likely prompt a full-scale Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union, with the equal likelihood that this would prompt a further attack on the Soviet Union from the West, whereas a decisive Soviet victory would contain the Japanese threat for a considerable period and allow the Soviet Union relative freedom to devote its attentions to preparation to meet an attack from the West. That major confrontation was to take place from May to September 1939. Known as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, after the river of the same name, this little-known conflict actually deserves to be known as a key battle that shaped the entire subsequent course of the Second World War. One Western military historian has described the significance of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol as follows. Although this engagement is little known in the West, it had profound implications on the conduct of World War II. It may be said to be the first decisive battle of World War II because it determined that the two principal Axis powers, Germany and Japan, would never geographically link up their areas of control through Russia. Had the USSR been forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously, the outcome of the war may have been very different, both in Asia and in Europe, and with cataclysmic consequences for humanity. Two factors were crucial in this. Besides the clear-cut Soviet victory at Khalkhin Gol, what must be acknowledged above all is the Chinese people's heroic resistance. Alongside the great patriotic war of the Soviet peoples, it was the Chinese people who shouldered the greatest burden and made the greatest national sacrifice in the world people's struggle against fascism. It was with the strong leadership of the Communist Party of China, which called for nationwide resistance by the whole Chinese nation and people first and most consistently, and with a national united front that would not have been created or sustained without the party's consistent, persevering, skillful, tenacious, and self-sacrificing efforts that, in the words of Hu Jintao, for a long time we Chinese contained and pinned down the main forces of Japanese militarism in the China theater and annihilated more than 1.5 million Japanese troops. The struggles of the Chinese, Soviet, and Mongolian peoples were also closely coordinated with that of the Korean people, who, their country having been colonized in 1910, had suffered under the iron heel of Japanese imperialism for longest. Although the Korean people had never ceased their fight for independence, for example with their Declaration of Independence in the March 1st, 1919 movement, as in China, the bourgeois nationalists proved themselves incapable of effectively leading the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist struggle. That task fell to the Korean communists led by Kim Il-sung, as KJ has just intimated, a brilliant guerrilla commander who for much of this time was based in northeast China. In the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union took the initiative to form the International Allied Forces, together with Chinese and Korean communists and other patriots. Kim Il-sung wrote in his memoirs With the Century, "With the organization of the IAF, a great change took place in our armed struggle. It can be said that with the formation of the Allied forces as a turning point, we switched from the stage of our joint struggle with the Chinese people to the stage of extensive joint struggle, which meant an alliance of the armed forces of Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, the stage of a new common front joining the mainstream of the worldwide anti-imperialist, anti-fascist struggle." Of course, within the overall context of the anti-fascist war, different forces had different class natures and hence different war aims and strategies, and naturally other people have dwelt on this too. So, just as bourgeois governments in Europe, from France to Norway to Greece, folded in the face of Nazi aggression, so supposed British colonial strongholds and fortresses like Hong Kong and Singapore fell to the advancing Japanese forces like skittles in a bowling alley. Throughout the region, it was the communists and the communist-led forces who led the resistance, fighting a protracted people's war, tying down the Japanese Imperial Army, surrounding them, and ultimately defeating them in China, Korea, Vietnam, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere. These different class interests, essentially fighting for liberation or fighting for empire, clearly manifested themselves on the conclusion of the war. Hence, Ho Chi Minh's declaration of Vietnam's independence on September 2nd, 1945, was met with British forces attempting to control the country until the French colonialists could return, this in turn leading to 3 further decades of war that would sweep across and devastate Laos and Cambodia too. US forces landed in Korea, occupied the southern part of the peninsula, suppressing the People's Committees and imposing a white terror leading directly to a genocidal war 5 years later, as Jody expounded in further detail. The Philippines communists returned to armed struggle, this time against US neo-colonial domination in 1946. The leader of the Communist Party of Malaya, Chin Peng, was awarded the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, for his wartime role fighting the Japanese, but by 1948 was leading a renewed armed struggle against British imperialism and subsequently against neo-colonialism, one that was only finally curtailed with a peace agreement signed between the Communist Party of Malaya and the Malaysian government in southern Thailand in December 1989. In China, with Chiang Kai-shek refusing to abide by the outcome of the Chongqing negotiations and reverting to visceral anti-communist form, the Revolutionary Civil War broke out in 1946, leading 3 years later to the founding of the People's Republic of China, which stands today as the single greatest event in history's long march towards human liberation. To a great extent, all this could be and indeed was foreseen, displaying the strategic and tactical brilliance that consistently characterized his approach to international affairs. In his 1940 article on policy, Mao Zedong wrote as follows: "The Communist Party opposes all imperialism, but we make a distinction between Japanese imperialism, which is now committing aggression against China, and the imperialist powers which are not doing so now, between German and Italian imperialism, which are allies of Japan and have recognized Manchukuo, and British and US imperialism, which are opposed to Japan, and between the Britain and the United States of yesterday, which followed a Munich policy in the Far East and undermined China's resistance to Japan, and the Britain and the United States of today, which have abandoned this policy and are now in favor of China's resistance. Our tactics are guided by one and the same principle: to make use of contradictions, win over the many, oppose the few, and crush our enemies one by one." Viewed in this light, we can understand, although the Western powers and the Western media either could not or would not, why on the rostrum of Beijing's Tiananmen Square, on the 80th anniversary of the September 3rd victory, President Xi Jinping was flanked by Russia's Vladimir Putin and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's Kim Jong-un. That the leaders of the United States, Britain, and other imperialist powers chose to absent themselves not only shows who truly carried the main burden of the anti-fascist struggle, but also who remains committed to upholding the truth and a correct understanding of World War II and its outcome, and hence to standing against fascism and war today. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.